Hello, everyone. Welcome to Town Hall. I'm a little shiny and frizzy. It's very humid today, so I apologize. Let's start today off by talking about student loans. They've come up, and student loans, and as a part of student loans, maybe fixing larger systemic problems. So for those of you new to town halls, a bunch of people are coming in. The way that you ask a question and the way these work is usually these start with a topic that I sort of start talking about, get everybody some time to come in. And then much like a regular town hall that you do in person, if you have a question, comment, whatever, drop it in the chat. It's sort of like grabbing a microphone or passing up a note card. This way, everybody gets to participate no matter whether you are in the state. It's a really big state. It's hard to get everywhere, hard to get venues. Still a pandemic, even though we're pretending it's not. So this is a great way to have those interactions. So today I thought I would start. Give me just a second. I have an alert that is not turning off. Today I thought I'd start with student loans because there is supposed to be a solution announced tomorrow on student loans. I don't know what it is. That everybody's sort of throwing out what they think it is. It seems like a lot of people think that it is a $10,000 forgiveness for households up to $125,000 is the likely package. That's a bad idea. I mean, I know that may have been sort of a campaign promise, but it doesn't fix the problem. And so when you come up with a solution, it needs to do one of two things, and hopefully both. Thing one that it needs to do is it needs to stop the harm immediately. And thing two is it needs to, forgive me just a second. I have minions creeping into the room. Skedaddle upstairs. Upstairs at this point in time. Up.
I don't have a computer.
I don't care. Upstairs until I'm done. Spencer, upstairs until I'm done, please. I don't care. Please, I'm doing a thing. You knew the rules. Please go upstairs. All right. Well, if you come back in this room, you're going to have an issue. So we've had some boundaries issues today. The end of summer is always so fun as a parent. Everybody's sleep schedules are off. It's hot at night and hard to sleep. Everybody's so excited to get back into the school year. So we have a lot of floppiness and boundaries challenges the last few days. Anywho, so I think you need to do one of two things. You need to, thing one, stop the harm, and thing two, stop the harm from reoccurring. So the $10,000 doesn't really do either thing. And it doesn't really do either thing for a couple of reasons. So $10,000 will help a lot of people legitimately, but it leaves, people are like, oh, it's, 40 to 50% of student loan borrowers. Great. But then what's going to happen is it's going to leave the other half sort of hanging out with no real relief. And because something was done, they'll have checked it off the list as a problem solved. And that other half is just sitting there with all that pain, unable to get it fixed. And it also doesn't solve the underlying problem. So my solution on this is we need to take care of the interest. The real problem with these loans, tuition's too high, problems with school, yada, yada, yada. Absolutely. But the real problem with student loans is they have a predatory interest rate. I ran into a solution where I got stuck. I had not intended to have student loans more than 2 to 3 years after graduating because I was just going to take one of those really horrible law jobs where you had to work 100 hours a week. And then, then we would move on with their lives. Unfortunately for me, I got pregnant in law school. With my husband in a completely normal relationship. I've actually had people straight face say to me, you just shouldn't have sex with your husband the entire time you were in college if you didn't want kids. Yes, well, I went to school for 8 years because I have 2 graduate degrees, and I'm sure that would be a super healthy marriage to not have sex for 8 years of it when you're in sort of your peak reproductive years where you're sort of the most interested in each other. And so despite preventive methods that were in place, we ended up with our oldest, who is lovely and wonderful, but suddenly working 100 hours a week out of law school wasn't possible. In fact, I couldn't even take all the law school classes that I wanted to take. I ended up having to shift some of the classes I was taking. I had to take out bigger loans for childcare. There was just a whole lot that happened with that decision that made things a lot more limited. I also couldn't work as much in law school. I'd taken on some jobs. Those were no longer available to me because I would have had to pay for childcare, and childcare costs really were exceeding what I would be able to make in any sort of reasonable way by the time I paid for commute and dry cleaning, and it just got icky quick. A lot of people don't finish school. And, people say, well, what about means testing? Well, these means are tested at the beginning. They are tested when students go into school. That's what the FAFSA does. If somebody has huge student loans, it doesn't mean they're rich or going to be rich. It means they didn't have any money to begin with. And they usually went to a lot of school or stopped and started. And there's a lot of things that we go to a decent amount of school for that don't pay very well, but are necessary. A lot of childcare places, for example, actually want somebody who has a degree in early childhood education. And those degrees are ridiculously expensive relative to the pay point that they have. So they're never going to be able to make much progress on their student loans. Or you can look at a lot of people think, oh my God, you're an attorney, you make so much money. A lot of attorneys don't. Right out of law school, I was offered a job at a place I would have loved to have taken, but it paid $15 an hour. I mean, that at the time was about the same price as a Burger King shift supervisor, and with my huge law school debt. And that would have technically qualified me for student loan forgiveness if I'd done it for 10 years, but I had a child, and childcare costs would have actually exceeded my income after taxes. So a lot of people get stuck in those positions. And so when we talk about things that are means testing is not great in most situations. There are things that we should means test, but when we look at means testing, what we end up doing is we end up chopping up our population into who can afford it and who can't. And though I think that people who could afford it should pay more, they should do it on the backside as a part of taxes and just an increased tax bill. It's a little bit more simplified, takes care of a ton of costs. Hold on just one moment. Children, I can hear you, so back upstairs. Now, it's not optional. You have to have the count of 3. 1, 2. If you're not up 3 done, it's no tech for the entire rest of the week. All the way upstairs. Go, go, go. Go, please. This is live. Thank you. I apologize. Again, end of summer wiggles. Usually they are not anywhere present in my events, and we've gotten multiple today, so it's a festive day. So at least I can multitask and can get back on task. So when you do means testing, especially when you're double means testing like this, when you're testing when people get the debts and then testing once they have the income. So for me, I'm finally making enough hourly that I'm very close to where if I put in, I'm scaled back a little bit right now for campaigning. But if say I whether I win or not at the end of the campaign season, I will probably be kicked out of any forgiveness that I would have eligibility for. Hang tight one more second. Please close the front doors. Hey, close this door. I can hear you still. Thank you. So I would, I run a real risk of being kicked out of forgiveness, but the debt was accrued when I was making so much less money. So now I've got this very, very large debt, and I have some income that I would be able to pay back with, but the debt has grown so much by capitalizing, by accruing, by just times when I've had to make lesser payments, like when I was on maternity leave. So all of that debt sort of snowballed to the point where being able to even stay on top of the interest payments is very difficult when you do sliding fee, or you're not paying $5,000-$6,000 a month on these larger debts when you get the debt required to go to law school or to go to medical school. MBAs pay fairly well for what it is, and they don't have nearly as many years. So those tend to even out a little bit quicker. But a lot of lawyers, when they come out of law school, they don't have big fancy jobs. And even the big fancy jobs here in Maine, They probably pay a little bit more now, but the big fancy jobs in Maine right out of law school only paid around $80,000 a year, and that was like a decade ago. And $80,000 back then still wasn't all that much by the time you paid taxes and other costs. So they also have done things like, it used to be if you were still in school or you were in some sort of deferral program or you were on a sliding fee income program, they changed the way they calculated whether or not your student loans were included into housing costs and affordability for purchasing or renting. And they've changed some of those guidelines. So, because they've changed that, that's part of why when people are like, oh my gosh, why aren't you living out in Sandy River already? Well, we were limited in what we could get for a mortgage because even though our income might support a decent mortgage, mine was all wiped out with the possibility of student loan payments when they returned, or if I decided to pay a lesser, if I tied to income, it really limited that. So a lot of people, when they come out of school with these large loans, now can't even get housing. And they're either stuck in housing situations where they, many of them can't buy, but some of them can't even rent. So the means testing is really a problem, especially when you do on the backside, because people who on the backside, maybe they got those loans 5, 10, 15 years ago, they're actually able to start making payments now. And maybe they just hit like $125,000 a year, which sounds like a lot. And it definitely is. But if you are earning $125,000 a year, most likely the loans that you had to get there are a very substantial amount of your salary. Or you sell cars. People who sell cars can make an awful lot of money. And actually, cars are probably the easiest way to get into that bracket, which I always find kind of surprising, although now there aren't that many cars to be sold. But, usually you're talking about dentists, doctors, attorneys, professional class folks, or it can also be psychologists, which we need, and it's very difficult to establish a practice. And a lot of those jobs do not pay that well, even with a master's degree. So psychologists and counselors, things that we really need. All these professions, even though they seem like they're paid very, very well, they're often needed and they're often really not paid that well. So I've seen attorney job postings that pay the less than or same as paralegals. I mean, a lot of attorneys just don't make that many wages. Same thing with doctors. There's a lot of pressure to go to a single payer health system that many doctors would not be able to afford to run a practice paying their student loans in rural areas if it was all on that reduced system. So they're all sort of tied together in this mishmash. When you apply means testing, particularly sort of a double means testing, people were means tested when they went into school and they're means tested coming out. What you're going to have is you're going to have people who get caught in these holes. The ACA has the same problem. Once you top out and don't get subsidies, that insurance is no longer affordable at all, and in fact will suck out a huge percentage of your income, but there's no help for it, and it can snowball. And if you have a single year where you miss a beat on anything, you're suddenly in a place where your credit is trashed and you just can't get ahead. So I don't like means testing for a lot of programs. I don't like means testing for healthcare. The ACA shows us why that is awful. I don't like means testing for student loan forgiveness or whether or not we're going to collect interest. And there are places and times when it's appropriate. For example, subsidized housing means testing is appropriate. But there are just places and times where it isn't, with essentials like, how are we going to get people out from predatory loans? How are we going to get people real access to healthcare? When you cut those lines, you end up with class warfare and injustice, and it just is not a great solution. So to me, the $10,000 doesn't solve the problem immediately for about half the borrowers, maybe a little bit more than half. That's a big problem. And it also doesn't fix the problem because we still have student loans happening. We still have college that's not free. And we still have predatory lending going on every single day for millions of students. So I don't think of that as a solution. I think of that as sort of political pandering when you're like, hey, we're going to give you some cash, but we're not going to fix the problem that gave people decades of worry. We're still going to have an awful lot of people that just aren't going to have their needs met. So Amy has chimed in. Can you break down who really loaned that money? What's the government's part? What's the servicing? And yeah, so she added in that, social workers, therapists, teachers, they all want master's degrees. And those are all very low paid professions most of the time. So when we're talking about who is loaned the money, pretty much anyone can get a student loan for almost any educational program. And a lot of those programs don't have a good return on investment. Like I said, for example, the community college, which in Maine here, there's kind of running a test program where there's free tuition for a couple of years. Before that, the tuition wasn't particularly expensive. It's actually a fairly affordable community college. But if you got an early childhood education degree, it's probably going to take you 5 or 10, if not more years to repay that 2-year degree just because the wages are so low. The costs of most colleges have really gone up. So for those of us who are a little older, a little more seasoned, around 2008, there was this huge, awful crisis that happened with a lot of financial investments, and a lot of government entities in particular discovered that they had been making some really, really ambitious investments and investment projections as to what they could do for retirements and pensions. And in the process of everybody tightening their belts, and as different industries sort of collapsed, 2008, 2009 was horrific. We had a lot of homeowners that went deeply upside down on their mortgages. A lot of people lost their entire retirement. It was a really bad time financially for a lot of people. And so at that point in time, interest rates were kind of in this wonky place. We're still fairly high, and still fairly high before that. Tuition was starting to get pretty unaffordable. It had started a few years before that, maybe a decade before that, like even before that, tuition was more affordable, but the interest rates were closer to 10%. So there was still that predatory interest that was involved. A lot of the states pulled back funding from colleges, and tuition really started to go up at that point in time because they had to make up the money somewhere to run all their programs. Tech's really changed. It's not, just buildings and salaries, kind of like it was before. Now there's a ton of tech that goes into running a college. That's all very expensive to maintain. And so tuition started really going up at that point in time. And it wasn't that many years earlier that they made student loans so you couldn't discharge them in bankruptcy, except under just very, very narrow circumstances, like your brain stops working entirely. There's just it's really hard to get out of a student loan. So there, you have to have a massive disability or injury that has occurred. You have to have or some sort of fraud perpetrated by the institution, which is difficult to get unless you're at one of those for-profit schools. So there's a lot that went into that. So college costs are going up. Interest rates are still here chugging along predatory. I have some of my student loans that are almost at 9%, which doesn't sound like that much, but if you can't discharge it, you can't really functionally refinance it. And the only way to get rid of it is paying it. And you have a huge loan amount that, for me, I had very little loans for undergrad. Most of that was, state school, community college. Most of that I kind of paid as I went. I did get a little bit in loans, but most of that was there. Grad school, boom, explodes. So I had huge loans, and I had to face the same decision-making problem that a lot of people do. And that's, okay, I have these big loans. I've realized at this point in time, because I had to take out extra loans for something, or, the market's shifted and people are not getting paid as much. Is the return on investment there? Do I stop with the debt that I have now and not have a degree and be just hosed? Or do I plow through it, have a degree, have the possibility of paying it back, have the possibility of, 30 years from now making it balance? And my first year in law school was 2008. So 2008, 2009, partway into that year was the first year it was published that law school graduates were not making enough to possibly make their loans worth the return on investment. Prior to that, everything that had been published before that was like, oh my God, if you go to law school, gravy, you're good. We'll loan you anything and it's all going to be fine. You're going to do well. Now, of course, that was not necessarily accurate. for everyone. Like I said, a lot of law school jobs or a lot of law jobs once you get out of school don't pay like that. But the perception and the averages backed it up, even if it wasn't the total. The averages sort of backed it up a little bit. So the backside of this is, so we get these huge debts, and it's, again, not always for law schools, for medical school. Therapists have it, counselors have it, social workers have it. Anybody with a master's degree is going to have some pretty enormous loans. I actually looked into doctorate programs as sort of a way to defer some of those payments so I could get my kids into childcare and school and get myself into a space where it was easier to make those repayments. And doctorate programs, a lot of them you didn't used to pay for. They used to actually pay you a stipend. But now a lot of schools have sort of turned to the doctorate programs as a revenue generation instead of sort of a prestige that they have that program. So a lot of places where you used to sort of be able to find respite and lowered tuition, those are starting to disappear. And you'll see a lot of graduates, if you kind of pay attention to different graduate genres on places like Twitter, you'll see a lot of graduate programs, graduate students in those graduate programs basically saying like, hey, you're now paying me like $8 an hour to teach grad school classes. Like, this is not okay. I can't live on this. This isn't, we're taking people at their peak reproductive years. And when it used to be, 60 years ago and tuition was $2 and it was all men, yeah, maybe this worked, but it doesn't work for where we are today. So with those costs going up and the loans becoming not dischargeable, we created this kind of disgusting industry. So banks can basically loan money to students, and there's several different types of loans. There's subsidized federal loans, which are still serviced by a servicer, and their entire job is to just take a cut of money off of this. No, go. I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of something. Go. Sorry. Nope. Upstairs, and if you come back down, there's no tech the rest of the week. That's it. I don't care. No tech the rest of the week. And parenting sidebar, I apologize. Our children are usually so good about these. This is the first time they've ever busted in, and today is just they're going to interrupt everything day. Those are usually, they don't have interest on them while you're in school. No interest is accruing, but it does start to accrue once you leave. Those are subsidized by the government, and those tend to be at kind of the lowest interest rate. For people who are very low income, there's Pell Grants that are below that, but those aren't loans, so those don't have to be paid back. Then there are subsidized loans, because as tuition grew, those loans, the subsidized ones, just aren't enough to cover most programs. Maybe they cover the programs, but not the books. So the unsubsidized loans, so the subsidized ones, lowest interest rate. Next is unsubsidized. Those accrue interest while you're in school. Some of them come with payments while you're in school. Some of them don't. I have no idea why we would have people making payments on loans while they're in school. Obviously, it's nice to not have the loans balloon so big, but the point is to be able to finish up school. And if you're having to work to do that, you're probably taking fewer classes, so you're not going to be able to make those payments. It's nonsensical. I don't know why they would put that in. If you had extra money and you're in school, of course you would either save it to make sure you have something for an emergency, or you would pay your loans. I don't know why they would have regular payments on that, but some of them do have regular payments. And then again, tuition kept going up. When I did my first year of law school, tuition was right around $41,000 a year. My first year of law school, you weren't permitted to work more than 10 hours a week. And, I took a job the first thing I could. And I was also doing a judicial internship. I didn't have children then, so I could do a whole lot. But working 10 hours a week at a grad student, so I was making $25 an hour, which was great, but I was 1099. So you lose about half that right off the top. That's not enough to pay $40,000 a year. That didn't include books. That didn't include health insurance. That didn't include anything at all. I mean, that was just tuition. So that was, law school the tuition for that has really blown up. Same for med school. Same for any of the other schools. Even if they're not prestigious, it's really gone up. So there's Grad Plus loans for that. So Grad Plus loans are at a higher interest rate, but also not dischargeable. And they accrue interest while you are in school. All of these loans, the interest and payments that starts accruing 6 months after. So you have to start making payments 6 months after you're out of school. So that way, if you're out of school only for a summer, it still kind of stays in that academic deferral space. But once you're out of school, then you're out of school and you're into the real world and your payments start 6 months later. Very, very, very few people could pay off their loans in that 6-month period. And so loan payments start. And the problem is once these loans capitalized, and this happened to me while I was pregnant, my loans capitalized and suddenly I had tens of thousands of dollars more debt that interest was accruing on than I was expecting. And I did not realize that they would capitalize when I was in maternity leave, because when I took on those loans, I never would have looked for that. I had no intention of having children in law school. That wasn't even on my to-do list. So a lot of people get trapped in these situations. So what you end up having is you've got the Grad Plus and then the federal loans, and they're all federally backed. They're all serviced by banks or servicers, and they just take a cut of the interest rate. We could be doing that servicing in-house. We could be taking care of these things for our students.
That forbid me.
I will not talk to you about this until after I'm done. We could be having an educated population. That is a reasonable subsidy that we could have. And give me just a second. Let me close this door. So we could be having a subsidy to make sure we have an educated workforce, and that would be super helpful to us. And as people are joining, there's been quite a few people that have come on. Please drop any questions, concerns, comments you have in the chat. So we subsidize businesses all the time, but we don't subsidize students very much. And I think that the interest rate is something we could do to fix that problem. And I think that this sort of philosophy should be applied to most of our problem solving on a federal level. We have people in office that they kind of throw money, and it's not even adequate money sometimes. And maybe it's money that benefits their friends or supporters more, but it doesn't really fix the problems. We have these huge problems that have been festering for decades. They have been festering, and they haven't fixed them. And so I think that if what comes out tomorrow is that we've got $10,000 of forgiveness for people with incomes of $125,000 or less, I think that a lot of people will be really happy. And I think we'll probably have about half the people that just are absolutely crushed. And people coming out of school that are absolutely crushed, that both literally and figuratively are going to be crushed by these debts that there is no way for them to repay and there is no help out of. And because there was something done, the legislative energy to get anything done is going to go away. And that is part of the problem with pandering solutions, when you're not fixing the underlying problem, when you're saying, there, I did something. Look, I did something for you. Why are you still asking me to fix this problem? It's because the problem's not fixed. And we have a lot of problems like that, whether it's healthcare, immigration, student loans, I suspect, are still going to be a festering problem, and you just have to fix the problem. So watch that. It's going to be interesting. The other question I have from Gary is, who's funding Golden? I'm being inundated with ads on Facebook and YouTube. I don't know, but gosh, it's awful, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if every election season, instead of this fundraising ad torture, we had Maine raising instead, right? And, any other candidates that are watching, steal it, make it your own, make it your state or your district, whatever raising. I would love to see us, instead of saying, I'm going to take care of the community, give me all your money so I can do that. I would love to have everybody say, you know what? I really want to take care of the community. I want to make sure we're fixing our problems. And I believe that the solutions are within the community, that the people who pitch the savior complex of give me all your money and I will make things go away, almost like it's a wealth disciple with some of those televangelists. It's not real. If we want to fix our communities, we invest in our communities. And that means we both send government funding and grants and programs and, realistic loans to communities that need them. It also means that when you're running for office, you should put the money into the community. If you're really saying, I want the money to go into the community, you are going to get so much further by saying, don't give me money. Stop. I don't need it. What am I going to do with it? Run some Facebook ads that annoy Gary? Let's not do that. Instead of annoying Gary and everybody else, let's take the same amount of money and make sure our food banks have food, or make sure that we're shopping at small businesses and those small businesses can survive and then don't need to ask for government aid. The amount of money that goes through in these election cycles is obscene. Obviously, I don't know how much money is going to go through this election cycle, but I think it was either 100 or 2. It might have been up to 200 million. I saw 100 million, but I've seen other sources citing 200 million. And that's probably the differences between like campaigns. And then if you add in like campaigns and PACs and all the other groups that pay for advertising. So in the Maine Senate race, and it was literally more money raised than anybody could spend. And it was on every single channel. And it was dead smack at the height of the first year of the pandemic. And people were hurting. People didn't have enough food. People didn't have a way to get childcare. People didn't have a way to pay their rent. And they were being taunted with these ads that didn't do anything for them. It's an awful way to run politics. We should be using these as community events to come together to really make sure that we're making sure our community is okay. And the person who you can trust to be doing that is probably a lot more likely to be the person you can trust to be down in DC and not interested in all the slime that happens down there. There's some good stuff that happens down there, but it's got a really heavy slime coating. I've only had questions from Gary and Amy. There's quite a few other people on. If anybody else has questions, I'll talk for another moment or two if you want to type them out. If not, I should be around Saturday morning at 8 for Breakfast with Tiffany. You always kind of get me how I am. So today I didn't have court. I had court. See, when I don't have Zoom meetings, my hair is just kind of pulled back. There's pens in it, not wearing any makeup. I'm wearing very comfortable clothing because it's humid and sticky. You're going to get the same thing on Saturdays. Saturday mornings, you get me how I really am. I don't dress up special for you. I'm just going to be wearing my LL Bean pajamas most Saturdays, unless it's too hot. Then I wear a lighter weight PJ. And I grab my tea and we sit down and we can talk things through if you have questions. I'm trying really hard to be the most accessible federal candidate that's around. That's one of my big problems. And I'm sure Gary has noticed this with Jared Golden. Jared Golden was Mr. I'm going to be able, you can get to me, and he was Mr. You can get to me when he ran in 2018. And for a few months after he got elected, and that was it. So, not a lot of town halls, not a lot of open question and answer. All of my stuff is unscripted. And as much as that means there's probably some trolls that will catch me making a funny face or that I won't always look my best, you can tell that even though I think about the things that we are talking about and I try to be generally knowledgeable on most topics, I obviously can't be knowledgeable on every single topic with perfection. There's just too many topics. And part of having this job is knowing when to phone a friend because you're in over your head on a certain topic. So for example, some of the environmental issues are going to be more technical than I am personally educated for. So I would have to phone a friend who's a scientist or a few friends who are scientists to make sure that I had a comprehensive knowledge. But it is just very difficult to have people representing you that you cannot get to. And though, if I prevail in November and I'm elected for the job, I won't be able to do 2 town halls a week. It is impractical. You should be seeing from me at least once a quarter with some sort of event that you could have that's open question and answer. Hold my feet to that fire, although I don't think you'll need to. I'll just do the job properly. But you should have a way to reach people. You should have a way to reach your representatives without always getting back a form letter. You should have a way to have this dialogue. So James jumped in and says, do you have any ideas about how we could reduce the overall cost of higher education? Yeah, that is both a federal and a state problem. So I do think no matter what we do with student loans, whether or not we make college free or whether it stays paid, but at reasonable rates and we subsidize and we have zero interest loans, which would really be the appropriate loans. I mean, when interest rates were 0% to lend to banks, why weren't they 0% to lend to students? Students should get at least as good of a deal as our banks get. So there needs to be some federal sourcing, but we as voters, we have to put some pressure back on our state budgets to say, hey, you took this money out of education and you need to put it back in. I mean, most states used to have substantially larger budgets as a percentage component for their university systems than they do now. The money never came back. When people are like, oh, we're cut up, but we'll put it back when things get better, they don't. It is more popular to do things, for example, in this state, Janet Mills sent everybody a check back, or most people a check back. And as much as I like money, that money was already taxed for me. I didn't miss it. It was gone. Why aren't we running better programming with that? Whether it's helping make sure colleges are more affordable, making sure our roadways are more drivable, making sure that we actually pay our state employees adequate, because with inflation, we aren't. I mean, there are people at Five Guys Burgers, when you figure their salary and tips, making more money than court clerks, which is just appalling. So we do need to kind of push back on that a little bit. And it's not popular. It's never popular to say, hey, we need to raise taxes, or hey, we really cut back to fix a giant problem we'd let fester for years by underfunding state pensions. It's no fun to say that, but it's a reality, and telling people things they want to hear instead of telling people things that are true, that's how you get way bigger problems, and that's how you keep having those problems fester. So how do you respond to people who paid off tuition or loans that get upset that other people's loans might be forgiven? I don't know. I think that's kind of that's a bad response. Not your question, but I think that most folks that I have met have said, boy, paying off my student loans sucked. And I wouldn't want anybody else to go through that again, including my own kids, or, my brother's kids, or my neighbor's kids. I also think that, I'd love it if my student loans were forgiven. That would be awesome. But that's also not my expectation. And that's not the policy that I'm pitching. Would I take it? Yes, of course I would take it. Boy, to not have to worry about that and just call that a de-stressor for all the years of stress I felt unnecessarily. I don't think governments should be in the position of stressing out their citizens more than necessary. That's actually one of my criticisms with how the student loan thing has gone. It's great if they give some forgiveness, but stringing people along for now years with, well, maybe you'll have payments, maybe you won't have payments, maybe we'll do forgiveness, maybe we don't forgive. That period, that low level background stress is so damaging to people's health. And we have that on everything. We have it on healthcare. We have it on education. We have it on childcare. Other developed nations have a social support network. We have women. Women will fix it all. I mean, they won't fix it all. We just won't pay them, and they'll figure it out, right? Yeah, women will take care of it. So that low level stress, that should absolutely not be something that governments subject people to. You should have clear policy. If they were going to do, $10,000 forgiveness, they should have given a date, a time, a way, a mechanism, the rules. This is the program. This is when it's going to go into effect. Stringing people along for like over 2 years, that's just awful. It's awful way to treat people. There's probably going to be some people whose loans might be or whose loans were already paid off that might be upset. And you know what? That's a policy choice. So, sometimes you change the way policy is done because the way it wasn't fair or equitable. And sometimes there's just limitations on reaching back to do damage control. I think the answer to that is we'll have more money spending in our economy, and it's going to help us all in the long run to make sure that those loans are repayable. And it doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit any of us to have people carrying student loan debt till they die, especially when it's going to be combined with medical debt until they die. We have people, heaping on so much debt as individuals for burdens that should really be ours as a shared purchasing decision. I personally have absolutely no problem putting all student loans in perpetuity at 0% interest and crediting for interest accrued, capitalized, and already paid. I think that's fair and what we should have been doing all along. It's the way it should have been. And then we also need to be working at making education more affordable. But we can see America is not doing as well with education. We can see that people are losing their critical thinking skills. And that is in part because it is now such a burden to go to school. We need to make school functional and affordable for everyone. And it needs to go further than high school. I mean, we are losing our edge international. You've got to work on the education of our society. They are all tied together. All of these pieces are interconnected. If you want to have doctors, therapists, lawyers, social workers, counselors in rural areas, if you want to have that, it's tied into education. If you want to have any of these things, they are also interconnected. And that makes them very difficult to tackle from a policy standpoint, but it also makes them just critical and necessary. And we need people that are in there pulling these webs apart and getting these solutions handled. So I don't have a first name. That's AC. I hope that answered your question. There might be some bitter Bettys, but there's always bitter Bettys. Let's have bitter Bettys and a better economy. And there's going to be fewer bitter Bettys if we do something about it than if we don't do something about it. So I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I've been talking for a while. My children have finally settled down. I'm so sorry for the disruptions earlier. But I am a regular person just like all of you. So sometimes life comes with disruptions. Some days your children are just a little bit more in your personal, professional space than they should be. And, some days you want to be more in your children's space than they want you. I took my oldest went on a tour of his new middle school in the last week. And boy, that was the first time I have ever seen him skedaddle away from me in embarrassed horror that mom was there, and just the most embarrassing person who could possibly be on his tour, where everybody had a parent. Everybody was sort of embarrassed of their parents, but he was particularly embarrassed of me because, he wanted to do that on his own, but that wasn't the sort of event it was. I don't know if there's any other questions. I've answered from Gary. I've answered from Amy. I've answered from James. I've answered from AC. If you want to get involved in the campaign, I'll talk through a little bit about that just in case any other questions pop up. You can find me online. The website is Bond, the number 4.me. You can volunteer there. You can find ways to get involved and get connected. The easiest place to find me for communication is either at these town halls. There's a web form where you can email me on the website, and those emails go directly to me. They're not filtered through volunteers. And I'm on Twitter. I answer most questions. I don't see every notification. I get a lot of notifications. Sometimes I don't get notifications. There's some accounts where, because of whatever, Twitter has decided that you don't show up in my notifications. Sometimes I find those months later, or I just never get them. I apologize if I don't see it. My direct messages are open. I try to check the unsolicited ones every couple of days. Those are the ways to get a hold of me. Do a Maine raising. It's like doing a single digital door knock from anywhere. You don't have to be in Maine for that. Just order something from a small business, leave a note, tell them that I asked you to invest in the community. Make sure you use #Maine raising. Tell them to look me up. This month we are funding teacher projects to get everybody back to school. There's a thread on my Twitter that you can find. If you don't like all the nonsense and the drama and the theatrical Twitter and the rage and the frustration that gets channeled by both me and supporters, you can just go to @Maine Raising on Twitter, and all that has is the lovely Maine Raising and the lovely help. You don't have to see any of the other stuff. I also mix in some personal stuff on my Twitter so that you know that I'm not cardboard cutout of a candidate. So you don't see that there either. While I was talking, Brian has said, any clue on how to address corruption? Well, that's a nice small question, Brian. I think that you start, and my ideas, I think they're the right ideas, but I think they aren't going to sound popular. I think you start by doubling the salary of Congress and or making housing available so that people don't feel compelled to take money on the side. The lifestyle and the cost of living there is so high that even on the salary that's available, it is very difficult to maintain two houses. So if you are, even if you have a shitty, awful apartment in DC, you're spending like $3,500 a month at least on top of whatever you've spent back home. That in and of itself puts a ton of pressure on people who are members of Congress to take money on the side, to do a side hustle, and to maybe not be as focused. We've got to suck the money out of campaigning, because that also takes people away from doing the job. And we as voters have to start sending people that aren't getting covered. In 2018, when I first ran, I really thought very legitimately, I'm like, I have 4 degrees, 2 of them are graduate, I'm a practicing attorney, I'm sensible and reasonable, and I'm not running around in a giant lobster costume, and I don't have any interesting scandals. I should get covered. This shouldn't be too hard. And I wasn't expecting tons and tons of coverage, but I was expecting it to be, well, the newspapers will cover me in the articles, and they seem to get opinions from every campaign, and it won't be too bad. But it turned out they don't cover you at all if you don't have money. So it doesn't matter how qualified you are. If you're not wealthy, they didn't care. And until we start pushing on our media to cover better and say, no, anybody who's on the ballot, even if they seem a little eccentric, even if they're poor, even if they're just middle class, cover them. All we're going to get is these candidates that are just ridiculous. I mean, we have this super important, super grown-up job, and the job interview is a game show. I mean, look at candidates like Dr. Oz. Exactly why does Dr. Oz want to be in the Senate? There's nothing that should be interesting for him. It doesn't come with the attention or the money or the enjoyment of anything he does. There's no diet pills to schlep there. Why would he want to be there? And it's because there's just a ton of money to be made on the side. We've got to cut off a lot of the abilities for people to engage in corruption. So this is something that Jared Golden agrees with me on. Finally, it was something I was talking about 2018. I'm glad he came to that party. I think that we shouldn't have folks that are in Congress selling stock. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that you should get that insider knowledge and be able to turn around and make a ton of money. And a lot of them do it in both parties. It's very common. I don't think you should be able to sell it at all, or at a minimum have some sort of functional blind trust. And maybe that's a congressional blind trust. Maybe it's completely taken out of them even being able to select who the administrators are. So there's a lot of little things that you can do, but we need to get different candidates in there, because with rare exception, almost everybody in Congress is a millionaire. And if they aren't, they become very quickly. And boy, makes you wonder how that's happening. And a lot of spouses are engaged in very inappropriate activity. A lot of spouses are like quasi lobbyists. We have to really put a very small box around what you can do when you're doing it. And we have to treat, a lot of people say that term limits are actually going to escalate it. It's going to keep it so you really can't get that job unless you're wealthy. I mean, we're asking people at the peak of their careers to step out when they may not be vested in their retirement. So if you can't look at it as a job you can do for a while, because the job takes a while to do it. Legislation is slow, it's methodical, it's purposeful, it's multi-year. You don't want people in and out for 2 or 4 years. They're not going to be able to get anything done. But you need to make sure that we allow people to sort of treat it as a profession. Don't feel the same way about the executive branch, but the business of writing laws, that's a serious, thoughtful, deliberative profession. And we should treat it like a profession, and not a profession like, I'm a professional politician, watch me raise all this money and sell you a bunch of snake oil. A real profession like, show up on time, prepared, ready to work, willing to work like your retirement depends on it, and willing to treat it like it's a professional job that you are responsible about. So a couple of good ideas. It seems they all become millionaires when they get to see DC. Indeed, don't they all become millionaires when they get to DC? How funny that is. I don't expect that I will become a millionaire overnight when I come to DC. Probably because when people in the past in my life have tried to offer me things that would perhaps make me more money, I, back away like Homer going into a bush. So I've been talking for quite a while. I have to wrangle my children and get them to bed at a fairly normal hour. It's closing in on 8, and that is right around their bedtime. And with school looming, I have to get them into that. If you need me for anything, you know how to find me. Find me on Twitter, find me on the website, or come see me on Saturday. We'll have breakfast together. And I hope you all have a lovely mid-August evening.